You were on the Human Sexuality Committee of the General Conference Mennonite Church in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get to be involved in that? And well, then I'll get into the particulars of what that actually looked like.
But how did I get to be involved? The real answer is I actually don't know. I have a guess about the connection. Here's my guess. When was it? 1980? Russia invaded Afghanistan, somewhere around there, and Reagan must have been after 80, because he was, I don't remember. Anyway, Reagan called up the draft again, right? This was 79, 80, somewhere in there. Reagan either was about to or did start up the draft again, and there was a conference at Goshen. This would have been halfway through my college years. There was a conference at Goshen around sort of church's response to, if they do call up the draft. There was what are we going to do about that? What's the Mennonite Church going to do about that? It might have been MCC organized, because it was both General Conference and Mennonite Church. Since it was a Goshen, obviously, it was both. They wanted, so it was like a 2-day conference. They wanted a group of people to sort of be the folks who drafted up an end statement, right? What's going to come out of this conference? And a friend of mine, bless his heart, nominated me, on the floor, right? It wasn't that big of a conference. There were maybe a couple of hundred people there. Nominated me to be on this committee that would do this draft. So there were, I don't know, 6 or 8 of us, I don't even remember anymore, on this committee who stayed up way too late at night trying to put a statement together that everybody would agree with. I don't know if you've ever done that, but talk about one of the most useless things in the world to do, right, is to try to put a statement together. So that was sort of my introduction, if you will, to working anything sort of at the broader church level. The only reason I can think my name was even known to anybody was because of that. I don't know why else it would have been known at the time. Anyway, so it was maybe a year after that conference. I got a letter from, I think it was Vern Preheim, who was the executive director, I think, of General Conference Church at the time. I might be making that up.
Big staff person.
Yeah, somebody important, exactly. Sending out a letter to me saying that they wanted to form this group to put together Human Sexuality Study Guide, and would I consider being on the committee. And I was probably maybe a junior.
Still in college.
Something like that. Actually still in college. By far the youngest on the committee. By far. I mean, I would guess that the next closest was into her 30s. That would be my guess. Yeah.
And what were those meetings like?
So there were 14 or 15 of us, something like that. Half from General Conference and half from Mennonite Church, because they wanted it dual. The co-chairs were one from Mennonite Church, one from General Conference. It was definitely my, I think it was my first introduction to sort of the whole notion of church politics and what plays a role in how things get done. Growing up, the churches in Phoenix, we were the General Conference Church. There were a couple of Mennonite Church affiliated Mennonite churches. And the 3 churches actually did quite a bit together. The youth groups did a lot together. So, I had friends and all of this. So I was familiar with Mennonite Church. It wasn't just General Conference. So I had notions about that. But it was definitely a somewhat harsh, at times, introduction to the differences between Mennonite Church and General Conference, the different ways, the different notions about sort of policy things, the different ways of decision-making. Mennonite Church folks much more aware of what their leadership might say or think about what was going on. And the General Conference folks really impatient with that. It's like, no, we can make the decision. We don't have to go and check it out with anybody. I mean, there was just different ways of understanding authority and hierarchy and all of that kind of stuff. So that often on various topics, not just on the section on homosexuality in the book, but on various topics, really played into how do we then put something on, because half the group is worried about what their leadership is going to say, and the other half of the group says, we don't care what our leadership says, we want this to go. So there were a number of difficult conversations. There were some fairly benign ones as well, not surprisingly. For me, particularly looking back, I might have appreciated it a little bit at the time. I don't know, but definitely, look, it was a huge experience for me, right? Just being a part of a group that has a task to do is all over the spectrum. We're talking about sexuality. Most of these folks hardly ever talked about sexuality in their lives, right? And here we need to start talking about it and using those words and coming up with ideas and figuring out not only what do we all believe and think about this, but how can we put together a process to help other people have these conversations. What a marvelous experience for a 20-year-old, right? I mean, and it really has shaped, I think, a whole bunch of ways of looking at group work. How do you get people who disagree to talk together, to come to some? And there were, on some of the issues, there were a couple of times, probably particularly around the homosexuality chapter, but even some of the others, that at the end of the day, I was just thinking, this is useless. There is no way we are so far apart that we're not going to be able to do much. And yet, we put together a study book that I think, for its time, and maybe not even just for its time. I looked at it 2 or 3 years ago again. I had a copy and happened to run across it. And there's some good stuff in there, right? In terms of just getting people to ask questions and think about things and start to talk with each other, right? It gives people an avenue to start to talk about stuff, which is one of the key pieces. So I really do think that I think that we as a committee fulfilled our role rather well. Do I agree with everything that's in that book? Not a chance. But there were 15 of us who had to come to agreement about this. And so I guess in a sense it is compromise, but I also think everybody compromised, right? It wasn't just the liberal side that had to compromise about what went in there. I think the folks who I would see as at the complete opposite end of the spectrum of where I am on a whole bunch of things also had to compromise a lot, because we were not stating out, here's what you should believe, right? We were asking questions. We were putting out information and saying, talk about X or talk about Y or figure out what you think about things. And for folks who would see this as a lot of issues around sexuality as a very sort of cut and dried thing, that's a huge compromise for them to say, no, people should talk about it, right? So there's compromise all around, which maybe in some ways turned out a product that at least would have stood the chance of actually being used. It wasn't, but it at least stood the chance of people from a variety of perspectives being able to pick it up and actually make use of it. Again, then church politics comes into play, and it's essentially not used.
So before we get to that, what was the timeline? How long did you work together?
We started I think our first meeting was in 81. I'm not positive about that, but I think our church meeting was our first meeting was in 81. We met 3 times a year, I think. And we met up until the 1986 Saskatoon conference, which was its own disaster. I do not remember if we had any meetings after that, 86. And then Purdue was a year later, right? 87.
So 5 years.
So it was about 5 years.
Yeah.
By Saskatoon, before Saskatoon, the thing was done.
Okay.
So it was probably about a 4-year process in order to actually have it. I bet that's right. I bet by 85 we were actually done with the guide itself. So about 3 years. There was work done in between, right? It wasn't just, that's the only time, right? I mean, people had taken on responsibilities for different parts of the chapter in order to put drafts together for the committee to respond to then. So that kind of work was being done in between.
Yeah. And what were these meetings like that you had? How were people engaging with one another?
So each time, for most of the topics, it was sort of one meeting per topic, right? So somebody was, maybe a couple of times it was 2 people, I don't think so. Somebody was assigned or had agreed to write a draft chapter on whatever the topic was, get it out to people ahead of time, and then during that meeting we went over it, sort of identified areas that we were either uncomfortable with or wanted clarified, or maybe wasn't there and needed to be put in. So it was a lot of discussion about the draft sitting in front of us, and they had hired a writer who would then, sort of a writer-editor, who would then take the draft, because the whole thing needed to hold together, right?
Right.
So they had hired somebody who then took that draft and made it sound like this was all going to come from the same person. So then he would, he would be there taking notes and making sure he understood what people were concerned about, and then they would do it. He would then write up the draft, which then would get reviewed in between. And so there were a couple of the topics that we had more than one session about, homosexuality, not surprisingly, being one of them. What was the other one? I think the one about marriage, I think, took a couple of different meetings to make sure that we were covering the pieces we wanted to. There might have been 1 or 2 other ones that went through a couple of meetings. But it was, I mean, the discussion really was, and I think for the most part, again, the homosexuality one aside, I think for the most part, it wasn't like it was contentious. I mean, people had different views and different perspectives, but I felt, and I think the 2 co-leaders did a really good job of sort of setting the atmosphere and saying, look, folks, we're all working together here with a common task, right? If we around this table can't figure out how to have these discussions, there is no way we're going to be able to put it into a book to help others have the discussions. And so I think they did a really nice job of keeping the focus on what is our role here, right? We do not have to come to agreement. That's not the role. The role is putting together something that gives people ways of starting to talk about some of this stuff. Again, it's not to say all the discussions were easy and in agreement, and that's, for me, coming out of it, that was one that really was a huge learning of, there are ways of sitting down at the table with people with whom you disagree so violently in some ways about, and yet you can be at the same table with them and talk and get up and go out and have dinner and it doesn't have to define whether in fact you ever interact with this person. And that was huge for me at the time. Big learning.
So what happened with the resource?
Again, this is from a very biased perspective, because I was on the committee and I think we all had visions of how this thing should be used. So I think the guide came out in '85. Theoretically, it was supposed to go to all of the churches. They were supposed to run through it, work through it. I don't remember at what point the general board of certainly the General Conference and obviously Mennonite Church as well, somewhere in that they really started pushing hard to have a statement then come out in '86. The committee fought really, really hard against that. And it was largely, I think, out of our own experience, right? We've been talking about all of these issues for 4 years, and we're in no way ready to come up with any kind of statement that all of us could then say, this reflects our beliefs around these topics, right? And here the general board was saying, okay, we're going to get this to you in maybe the summer or fall of '85, and less than 9 months later, you're going to be at a conference in which we want you to vote on a statement. I mean, how ludicrous is that, right? And the committee, I don't know without exception. It could be that there were some folks that really thought this was appropriate. But a whole bunch of us were saying that's not useful. And because our thinking, and I think this is what happened, a whole bunch of churches then said, oh, well, if we're going to vote on a statement, why do we have to go through why even bother with the guide, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if the answer is going to be given to us, right, why study for the test? I mean, that's kind of how it felt to us. It's like, what's the point? So I think for the most part, hardly any of the churches ever worked through it. I hardly ever hear of somebody who knows what that was, who even knows the process happened, and who knows, who saw the study guide, much less than actually was a part of a church group that worked through it. Mm-hmm. So I think for the 15 of us, again, maybe not all 15, for a bunch of us, it really was this feeling of, so we worked our butts off for 4 years, and you're going to go put it on a shelf. I felt really frustrated, and I think that was, I think for me personally, part of my anger and frustration about the statement at Saskatoon was not just because of what that statement said, but was because of feeling like, okay, you just dissed all of my work, right, that went into this. So obviously I still feel some unkind feelings about that approach. It was wrong. There was no, I'm not sure if there's ever a reason for that kind of a useful reason for that kind of a statement, mm-hmm. right? But certainly not that soon. I think that was a big mistake.
Do you want to talk about Saskatoon?
Saskatoon.
Were you there?
Yeah. So because the committee, this is my memory of the event. I may be wrong about actually the spacing. The committee gave its report right before the general board proposed the statement. So the committee went up on stage. I don't know that our Mennonite church colleagues were there. I think some of them probably were. I don't think everybody was. And I did not go to Purdue, so if the same thing happened at Purdue, then not all of us were there either. We were on stage, introduced, the study guide was talked about a little bit. The GC chair of the committee talked sort of through the process and what the committee had worked on over time, kind of a little bit about how it had done its work. What was happening with it, and then and I think, which he had told the general board he was going to do, he made pretty clear that the committee did not think there should be a statement, that the position of the committee was this should not be happening, and the thing we did do was to make sure that the general board said that this statement was coming from the general board, not from the committee. Although that message, I've heard lots and lots of people since then say that the committee brought the statement, right? So, which is, history gets smushed together, right? But at the time it was really important for us to say that. And I think we all knew, we being sort of LGBT allies, and even folks who maybe don't agree with us, but certainly didn't think we were ready for a statement. I don't know that we were surprised at the direction at what the statement said, or at the fact that it was passed. Mm-hmm. Certainly sad. That was more than sad. So that was really hard, I think, to deal with that at the time. But it isn't. I think it was more, reality fell. We already knew we'd lost the game, right? It was just the final buzzer went off kind of thing, right? And just I don't know, I think ever since then, maybe even before, but ever since then, I just have very little belief in statements. I just don't. It's like, all they do is cut off conversation, mm-hmm. right? That's what they do. And it's what's happened. There have been attempts to revive conversations mostly around LGBT stuff, but even around other aspects of sexuality. And inevitably, from a whole bunch of folks, you hear, well, we have a statement already. Why do we need to talk about that, right? The word has been given. We don't need to deal with it. And so to me, statements cut off conversation. They're not helpful. Mm-hmm. They give an answer that, yes, a majority of people, but only a majority of the people who were there at the conference, able to vote. So actually you're talking about not very many people, right, who made that decision. And yes, there are folks behind them, but we're not talking the Mennonite Church things. We're talking about, okay, somewhat over 50% of the Mennonite Church thinks this. That means there's a whole lot of people who either don't think it, or certainly don't think we should have a statement about it. And yet now history has just lost all of that, right? Now history says the Mennonite Church has a statement, has a position. It's like, no, it doesn't, right? So anyway, yeah.
What does the statement say?
Well, clearly, okay, yeah, I don't know what the whole statement says anymore. The key pieces that have been brought up over and over and over again are, I'm not going to get this right because I'm going to say it how I think of it in a biased way. So that's not a fair question. It says, what I don't remember is whether it says marriage is defined as between one man and one woman, or whether it says sexual intimacy is defined between. And I bet it doesn't say sexual intimacy because that would be using the sex word, and I bet they didn't want to do that. So,
to tell you the truth, I was thinking it was marriage, but I also thought there was a statement. See, this is my memory.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it in 10 years.
I know, right.
Is that sexual intimacy should be within the context of marriage?
Oh, maybe that's what it says.
That's my recollection, but I could totally be wrong.
No, but that makes more sense, right? Because given how people usually view marriage, I think just saying marriage, now the statement marriage between one man and one woman would carry a different kind of weight than it would have been. So I bet you're right. Sexual intimacy is only within the context of marriage between. So
that's my recollection.
Right. So it says that, and then the other piece, of course, that was sort of jaded view that was the bone tossed to all of us was, but we need to sort of something along that, right? We need to continue listening to our brothers and sisters and keep talking about, yes, thank you very much. If people have the answer, why should they study for the test? There's, why even bother? If you're already uncomfortable, and if you're uncomfortable with it, and you have an answer, where's the incentive to talk? So, and I think the Purdue statement for the Mennonite Church, it wasn't exactly the same, but it was comparable. I think it had those two pieces, and it was kind of comparable. Yeah.
And it's been carried out in a very similar way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right.
In terms of the actual business sessions and delegate sessions, what are your memories?
At Saskatoon? That's interesting. I don't have a real clear picture of that. My vague memory is that, as always, there was time for people to get up and say things, and there were. So the statement was read. The proposed statement was read, and then there was the time for the delegate discussion. My memory is that people got up and spoke, sort of both for and against. But otherwise, I don't remember a whole lot about what happened there. I really do think it was a foregone conclusion. There was no way. This is in the mid-'80s, right? There is no way that group of delegates was going to vote it down and go home and tell their congregations they voted it down. That was not going to happen. Which is part of the reason why the committee was so dead set against having the statement in the right. If you give people an easy out, and the easy out is to go with what you've always believed, right? And what you've always believed is it's wrong. Of course, even if they aren't sure what they think, if they have to vote, they're going to vote the easy way, not the hard way. And so I think that was a foregone conclusion. But anyway, back to your question. I actually don't remember the conversation.
I can't remember the conferences I went to.
Yeah, and my guess is that it was so overshadowed by the expectation of what was happening and the end result that, that feeling of, oh damn, I remember very clearly, but not much that went before it.
How did you come to be involved with BMC?
This goes back a little bit to the other piece of the Human Sexuality Committee, which we haven't talked about yet, which is, so my coming out process actually started while I was on that committee. I was a late bloomer, if you will. And so part of what happened during the time on that, so just in terms of me starting to think about who I am, right? And how I make sense of the world, and starting to realize that, you know, I'm not sure that I'm gonna get married to a guy, right? There are other possibilities out there. I was not surprisingly, I wasn't ready to label myself, and I still feel like I'm not sure how useful the labels are. In some instances, yes. In other instances, no. But it was certainly not, okay, I'm going to get married to a guy, right? There are other people out there to think about having relationships with. So, and as that became clearer and clearer to me, then this business of relating to this committee in some ways became harder and harder, because obviously they did not put anybody open on the committee, right? Again, early 80s, let's remember when this was not going to happen. And having then somebody, an LGBT person on the committee, what would that have done? So that was tough for a little while to figure out how to handle that. I really did not want to mess up the process. I really didn't. I thought that was, I thought it was important, what the committee was doing and how it was going about doing it. I finally geared up the courage and sat down with the two chairs and said, I need to know what to do here, right? I'm lesbian, this is, what do? Do I tell the committee, right? Sort of in the spirit of being honest and transparent, right? I mean, part of the working together was really learning to trust each other, right? So that you could say what you really thought. So here I am suddenly withholding what, on the one hand, I felt like was irrelevant because it's not like it shifted my views of things, not surprisingly. On the other hand, I knew that to a whole slew of people would be very relevant, right? Because, as we know, folks in the minority are seen as more biased if they're speaking out than folks in the majority, right? So Black people speaking out about racial kinds of things are seen as more biased about those topics than white people speaking out about, right? So it's harder to pretend that you're neutral if you're on the minority side. It's just the way things are. It's not a good thing, but it's the way things are. Anyway, so I sat down and I had a conversation with them. Their pretty much immediate reaction was, if you tell the committee, it'll get back to the general boards and the whole process will be scrapped. The whole thing will just stop right then, as soon as it gets back. Because the general board can't possibly take the risk of anybody in the constituency hearing there's an open LGBT person on the committee, right? And there's no way to keep it, there would not have been any way to keep it confidential. It just, it doesn't matter. So I hemmed and hawed about that for a while and finally decided I was not ready. And some of this I think was age. It was 21? I was not going to take responsibility for scrapping this. Just wasn't. But because of that whole process and starting to talk with other people then about the committee, about my process, about that conversation and the difficulty of that, I was just starting to talk with people and come out to more people. And word sort of started then spreading around in 86 then, right? I think was the first BMC conference. Maybe not the first one, but certainly the first, it was in Chicago, I think.
86 right? Or 88, I can't remember.
I think it was 86.
Okay.
So I went to that conference.
After Saskatoon.
So it was after Saskatoon, right. Yeah. So I went to that conference. I mean, I already knew some of the folks there at least, but went to the conference, started opening my mouth, talking to people, and then I think it was right after that, or was right around that same time that maybe a little bit after, they asked me to be on the board, on BMC board. I don't remember if it was before or after that conference. But anyway, word, as it does, right? Word gets around. Even if you don't tell people, word gets around. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the tape.
Okay.
We got 4 minutes left on this. You've been talking for 57 minutes.
Oh, joy. Yeah, good.
So we'll go ahead and stop, take a break.
Okay.